From the moment I stepped into Magnetidine's sleek halls, I felt the curious glances and heard the whispered comments trailing behind me. Starting a new job was never easy, especially when seasoned employees eyed newcomers with a mix of interest and skepticism. I had left behind a broken trust, searching for a fresh start and a place where I could rebuild a sense of normalcy. Joining Magnetidine was daunting. The busy conversations, constant keyboard clatter, and confident strides of experienced staff were both inspiring and overwhelming. I wanted to fit in, to find a place that didn't remind me of my past. But forming genuine connections in a competitive work environment was its own challenge. When I pushed open the tavern door, the noise was as loud as a stadium cheer. I bet I know what game they're glued to, I thought, a bit sarcastically. The noise dipped as I stepped inside, but I ignored the looks and scanned the room until I saw Marge waving from her table. As I walked over, the volume resumed. Marge stood up as I approached. Unsure of what to do, I offered a handshake, but she pulled me into a warm hug. That gesture meant more than she knew. Most of the executive secretaries had been indifferent toward me. As the president's secretary, Marge was respected, so her inviting me out was significant. "I'm glad you came, Jessica," Marge said as we sat down. "I wanted to get to know you better." "Thanks for inviting me, Marge," I replied. "My friends call me Jess." A cheerful waitress appeared to take our orders. Marge ordered a beer and I asked for a wine spritzer. She raised her eyebrows slightly but didn't comment. "I really appreciate this, Marge," I said sincerely. "It's been hard settling in at Magnetidine, so it means a lot that you reached out. Some of the other women haven't been very welcoming." Marge patted my hand. "It's not that they dislike you, Jess. You're new. And Mary, the woman you replaced, was with us for years." "That makes sense," I nodded. "And," Marge added, "your appearance might be a factor. Some of the women feel a bit intimidated because you're so "Please don't say that, Marge," I interrupted. She raised her brows again as I quickly explained, "I'm not trying to be modest, but I'm not beautiful enough to be a model." She gave me a doubtful look. "I'm not so sure. Most of us would love to look like you, and that brings a bit of envy." "They wouldn't envy me if they knew how it's affected my life. Beauty can be more of a curse than an advantage," I said. Marge looked skeptical. "We spend so much on clothes, hair, and makeup to look the way you do naturally. We're the ones cursed." I shook my head. "You might think that, but you'd be wrong." I avoid making eye contact with men because they often take it as an invitation. "Is that so bad?" Marge asked with a smile. "Yes," I said firmly. "It happens so often and most of them are creepy or annoying." "Oh, come on," Marge laughed. "There must be nice guys too." "You'd be surprised," I said. "The nice ones think I'm out of their league, so it's mostly the pushy ones who approach me." "I can't believe you don't get attention from decent men." "What about them? In my experience, they're often worse. They think they're doing you a favor by being seen with you and will ditch you the moment someone else catches their eye." The waitress returned with another wine spritzer. "I didn't order that," I said, confused. "I know," she replied. "That guy over there sent it," gesturing behind me. I turned against my better judgment and saw a heavy-set man approaching. He pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat without waiting for an invitation. "Hey, I'm Al. You looked like you could use some company," he said. "I'm sorry, Al," I said politely. "I'm already with my friend and we're just catching up." He didn't glance at Marge. "That sounds boring. Let's have some drinks and find somewhere more exciting." "No," I said firmly. "I'm not interested." "Come on, sweetheart," he said, gripping my hand with his sweaty one. "You'd have more fun with me than her." I shot Marge an "I told you so" glance before turning back to him. "When did you move to this country?" I asked, feigning boredom. He blinked. "What? I was born here? And yet you never learned what no means," I said, pretending to be amazed. Marge burst out laughing as his face turned crimson. He stood so fast, his chair tipped over. Muttering something under his breath, he left. I turned to Marge. "See what I mean?" "Wow, that was intense," she said, still chuckling. "And that's without me encouraging it," I added. "Imagine if I gave any positive signs. I even have to pick my clothes carefully to avoid too much attention." Marge started to speak, but I continued. "And another thing. I noticed your reaction when I ordered the wine spritzer. I can't afford to relax too much in social settings. I'm always on guard." Marge's eyes widened suddenly as she asked if it happened at work too. I responded with a dry smile, confirming that it did. And quite often. She worriedly inquired if Tom Moffat was involved. I reassured her that he was wonderful and treated me like a granddaughter. Looking relieved for a moment, Marge then narrowed her eyes and questioned me about Mr. Silverbeard, Scott Benson, the sales director, known for his prematurely gray beard and reputation as a ladies' man. I laughed and admitted that he had hit on me on my first day. When she smirked and prompted for more, I added that he continued to do so almost daily, which made her laugh. She then asked about Peter Hamill, the marketing director who worked closely with Mr. Moffat. I told her that while he hadn't directly approached me, he did look at me when he thought I wasn't aware. Marge acknowledged that and noted he was married before asking if there were any others. I nodded and said that nearly everyone except my boss had shown interest. Marge chuckled and asked if there was anyone special in my life at the moment. I told her I was out of the dating game. She expressed surprise and inquired if there had ever been someone serious. Feeling the tension in my clenched fists, I admitted that there had been, but it was a painful story, better left for another time. Marge nodded, understanding, and we switched to lighter topics. By the time we left, I felt like I'd made a friend, which was rare for me. Driving home, I was grateful Marge hadn't asked about the women at work. A few had approached me too. Men were difficult, but at least they were predictable. Women could be worse. Friendly to your face, but full of jealousy behind your back. The following week, I was working on some correspondence when Peter Hamill came by. He waited until I paused typing and asked, "Can I ask a favor?" On guard, I wondered if this was when he'd make his move, but he surprised me. "Do you know Karen, Scott's secretary?" he asked. "I've met her, but not well," I said. She was young, pretty, and seemed smart enough. Scott's upset with her over a late report, and I'm afraid he'll let her go. I wasn't shocked. Scott's department had high turnover, due to his impossible standards and public criticism. Senior management seemed to ignore it, probably because of his impressive sales figures. Peter expressed hope that I could help Karen keep her job. A thought crossed my mind, and I asked if he was romantically involved with her. He looked shocked and denied it, reminding me both were married. I questioned why he would care about Scott's secretary if not for an affair. He explained, looking cautious, that he felt responsible for her since he had hired her. He clarified that he had recommended her for the promotion to Scott's secretary, believing in her potential, but underestimated Scott's harshness. He felt guilty for putting her in that difficult position and wanted to help. I watched him closely for any hidden motives, but saw none. I asked what he wanted me to do. Peter suggested giving Karen some of my work, while Scott was away and writing a positive memo about her to Mr. Moffat, which could protect her from being fired for incompetence. Knowing Scott's need to impress his superiors, I thought the plan might work. Still cautious, I told Peter to have Karen meet me for lunch so I could decide for myself. Peter agreed and left, returning shortly to tell me Karen was on board. We met for lunch, and after a brief interruption from the overly chatty waiter, I got to the point. I asked if she and Peter were involved or if he had made advances. She was genuinely surprised and denied both, insisting she was happily married and that Peter knew her husband. Her response felt sincere. I told Karen I still didn't understand why Peter was helping, but she suggested that he was just a kind person. She seemed sincere, so I decided to help her and outline the plan, which she appreciated. A week later, I noticed Peter near my desk. He thanked me for helping Karen, mentioning he saw my memo on Scott's desk. I replied that I was happy to help and that Karen had potential. Feeling guilty for doubting him earlier, I told him I was impressed by his effort. He blushed, modestly saying it was no more than anyone else would do. As he was leaving, Peter invited me to join him for lunch. Normally, I would have declined, but he seemed genuinely kind, so I accepted. Over lunch, I discovered more about him, including his devotion to his wife, Callie, an accomplished interior designer. He proudly showed me photos of her and her work, which was impressive and had even been used by some company executives. Before Peter could continue, a team member interrupted, needing his decision on expo collateral. Another soon joined with a work question, and before long, a team meeting formed at our table. Peter shot me an apologetic look, but I gestured for him to continue. I watched him work, noticing how he listened, asked questions, and guided his team without intimidating them. They respected him without fear, which was rare to see. As I left, I thought, it's refreshing to see someone in charge who isn't a jerk. Later that afternoon, Marge invited me to the tavern again. I was glad for the second invitation and accepted. After our drinks arrived, she leaned forward and asked if anything was going on between Peter and me. I assured her it was purely professional, explaining we went to the cafeteria after discussing work, which let me get to know him better. Marge raised an eyebrow and asked what I'd learned. I told her Peter seemed genuinely nice and respected as a leader. Seeing she wanted more, I added that he was devoted to his wife. Marge tilted her head, questioning if that was all. I sighed and firmly reminded her that I wasn't interested in male companionship and would never break up a marriage. Her expression softened, and she said, "Someone hurt you, didn't they? Want to talk about it?" I was ready to brush it off, but suddenly I found myself sharing the painful story. I explained that I met my husband during my senior year of college, and we married after graduation. At first, life was great. He loved showing me off, and although I felt uneasy, his excitement made it worth it. He soon encouraged me to wear more revealing clothes, and I agreed to please him. Our relationship started well, and our intimacy was fulfilling for me, though not for him. A couple of years in, he suggested role-playing. It hurt at first, but I eventually played along, imagining actors like Brad Pitt. Marge joked, "Good choice," before quieting down. But that wasn't enough. He pushed me to think about past boyfriends and other men we knew, which made me uncomfortable, but I went along. Then he wanted me to flirt with strangers at bars. After admitting some were attractive, he became more excited, and for a while, our relationship thrived on it. But when he suggested I date someone else for real, I was stunned. I told him he was the only man I wanted, and that I truly meant forsaking all others. He stopped for a while, but soon started again with comments and questions, until he finally said that, to prove my love, I should sleep with another man. Marge, puzzled, asked why he'd do that. Was he looking for an excuse to see other women? I told Marge that I'd wondered the same thing, but my ex had insisted he wasn't interested in anyone else. He claimed he just wanted to watch me with other men and kept saying it would make me happy. I told him the only thing that would make me happy was for him to drop the idea. But he didn't, did he? Marge asked. I confirmed that he hadn't. One Friday I came home to see an unfamiliar car in front of our house. Inside, my husband was speaking with two large men. He introduced them and then shocked me, saying they were there to spend the night with me for his thrill. Tears welled up as I shared how betrayed I felt. My husband, the man I trusted most, was treating me like an object for his own satisfaction, just like so many others had. It was the ultimate betrayal. I made an excuse, left the house, drove to my parents' place, and never went back. After my divorce, I moved away to start fresh, which is how I ended up here. Marge squeezed my hand and expressed her sympathy. I continued, explaining that as he was telling me his plan, I noticed video equipment around the room. He intended to film everything, and I could have ended up online if I hadn't left. Marge's face turned pale. "That's unbelievable," she said. I couldn't stop crying. The worst part was wondering what I did wrong or how I could have saved my marriage. I felt like a failure. Marge reassured me that it wasn't my fault and that there was nothing I could have done to change it. I sighed, admitting that despite her words, I still felt that way. I explained that this experience was why I had no interest in dating. As I wiped my face, I noticed a man approaching our table with 2 drinks. Seeing my tears, he turned around and walked back to the bar. Marge noticed and laughed, saying it looked like I had found a way to keep unwanted attention at bay. I managed a small smile. When we left the tavern, Marge walked with me to my car, giving me a supportive hug and telling me things would get better. I hoped she was right. The following weeks were hectic as Expo approached. It was an important event for Magnetodyne, crucial for launching new components and securing major orders. Success would set the tone for the year. Failure could be costly. Adding to the chaos was a rumor that Mr. Moffat was retiring. I doubted it since he hadn't indicated anything to me. The second part of the rumor was that either Peter or Scott would be chosen as his replacement, dividing the office into pro-Scott, pro-Peter, and anti-Scott groups. Tensions were high, made worse by tight deadlines. Amid this, Mr. Moffat asked me to deliver comments on pricing information to Scott. I discovered Scott was working from home and suggested I bring the materials there. Although I was wary about going to his house, I agreed since it was urgent. Scott lived in an upscale neighborhood, fitting for an executive. I parked, walked up to the porch, and rang the doorbell. But no one answered. I was surprised and tried to look through the windows to see if anyone was home. I checked around the side of the house, but still didn't see anyone. Just as I pulled out my phone to call him, I thought I heard voices from the back. I hesitated, but then started walking toward the back of the house. The voices came from the screened-in porch at the back. As I got closer, I slowed down, sensing something strange. Peeking around the corner, I quickly drew back in embarrassment. The sounds I heard were Scott with a woman. I froze, uncertain about what to do. I was there to deliver materials for Scott, but couldn't announce myself. As I hesitated, I heard the woman, and to my shame, curiosity took over. It had been so long since I'd been intimate, and this unexpected scene captured my attention. It was clear the woman was enjoying herself. I saw her lying on a lounge chair, Scott beside her. His hands moved over her body, making her arch with pleasure. My breath quickened, and I felt a warmth rush through me. Without realizing it, I lifted my phone and began recording the scene. Scott then climbed onto the chair, and the woman eagerly positioned herself to join him. Even from where I stood, it was clear she needed no assistance. The breeze carried the scent of their encounter, making the moment even more surreal. They moved together, lost in each other, and she leaned down to kiss him deeply. I felt a pang of envy. Why couldn't I have someone like that in my life? Scott then shifted positions, taking the lead in a way that showed his confidence and control. She reacted with visible emotion, holding on to him as if seeking closeness. He started speaking, asking if she liked it and comparing himself to her husband. A chill went through me when she answered, confirming his words. Scott boasted about an upcoming promotion, claiming he would treat her husband just as he was treating her. Her moans turned into loud cries, and I worried about being seen by neighbors. So I hurried to the front of the house, left the documents at the door, and rushed to my car. My hands shook as I drove away. What am I going to do? I kept asking myself. Telling Peter would devastate him, but I couldn't keep this to myself. At the office, I struggled to concentrate. The scene replayed in my mind, making me sick. Peter was a good man. Why would she betray him? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the phone. Peter, it's Jess. Are you going to be in the office for a bit? He chuckled. Yeah, probably working late till the expo. Can I stop by around 5:30? I asked. Sure, come anytime, he said cheerfully. I winced, knowing that cheer wouldn't last. Walking to Peter's office felt like heading into surgery. You know you have to do it, but every instinct tells you to turn around. Peter greeted me warmly, but his smile faded when he saw my face. What's wrong, Jess? I sank into a chair. I have bad news, Peter. I wish I didn't have to tell you this. It's okay, he said. Just tell me. Avoiding his eyes, I explained. I went to deliver documents to Scott's house today. When no one answered, I walked around and heard noises. I looked at his porch and saw this. I played the video on my phone and handed it to Peter. His initial reaction was a bitter laugh. So that's working from home, he said, not surprised. He tried to return my phone, but I urged him to watch further. As he continued, I saw the moment he realized what was happening. His face fell, showing pain and anger. I felt tears come. It's hard seeing someone's world fall apart. When I reached for the phone, he gripped it tightly. There's more, isn't there? He asked, strained. You don't want to see it, Peter, I said, knowing he wouldn't stop. The video played on, with Peter's wife's voice confirming everything. He went pale. I silently wished I'd never have to see anyone that broken again. When the video ended, Peter slumped in his chair. After a moment, he looked up, eyes hollow. The worst part? It's not just that Callie cheated. It's how she held him, kissed him. It was more than an affair. I couldn't find words to comfort him. All I could say was, I'm so sorry, Peter. Suddenly, something clicked. Peter, Scott wanted me to see this. He asked Mr. Moffat to have me deliver those papers. He wanted me to witness it and tell you. Peter's face hardened. He's always hated me. This is his way of getting back. But why? I asked. You two are rivals. But why go this far? Peter sighed. Before you joined, Scott worked for me. I thought he was smart but reckless. I saved his job once when he lashed out over an audit. I calmed him down and fixed the situation. Later, I recommended him for a promotion. Confused, I asked, he resents you for that? Shouldn't he be grateful? Peter shook his head. In Scott's mind, being indebted to anyone is unacceptable. He never forgave me for it. But why reveal the affair? Isn't he risking trouble? Peter's voice was bitter. The company would consider it a personal matter. Scott wants me to react and sabotage myself, or be so humiliated that my work suffers during a messy divorce. He looked at me, his tone serious. And he chose you as the messenger to get back at you for resisting him. I flushed with embarrassment, then anger. But my main concern was Peter. What will you do now? I asked. He clenched his fists for a moment before relaxing. Right now, I'm just going to focus on preparing for Expo. I can't afford to lose my job, but after that, I'm divorcing Callie and figuring out how to deal with Scott. Peter, I've been betrayed before, so I can understand some of what you're going through. If you need anything, just ask. But please, don't do anything that could hurt you. Thanks, Jess, he said quietly. I appreciate it, and I know how hard it must have been for you to tell me. For now, please, keep this to yourself. I'll bury myself in work. That's the only way I know to handle the pain. He managed a small smile. It also gives me a reason to stay away from Callie. As I turned to leave, I glanced back, feeling my heart break. Seeing a good man's life fall apart was devastating. The days leading up to Expo were tense. Some of it was typical pre-event pressure, but there was added friction between marketing and sales. Rumors spread that Mr. Moffat's retirement was near and that Scott Benson might take over. This fueled tension. Scott's team worked hard to impress him, while Peter's team grew anxious at the thought of Scott leading. I became an unofficial part of Peter's team, offering help when I could. At first, I got a few curious looks at the lunch table. But once Peter welcomed me, the team did too. They didn't hide their frustration. If Scott becomes VP, it'll ruin the company, was a common sentiment. It was unsettling to hear talented employees talk about leaving if Scott got promoted. Meanwhile, their respect for Peter was high. When he wasn't around, they shared stories of how he'd helped solve problems, offering advice that motivated them to improve. It was clear who should be promoted, but I knew executives often prioritized short-term gains over long-term well-being. Peter looked more stressed each day, and I worried he was reaching his limit. The pressure of Expo, his rivalry with Scott, and the situation with Callie were wearing on him. 2 days before Expo, I went to Peter's office. It was late, but I knew he'd still be there. Sure enough, he was with a small group, focused on his computer. Not wanting to interrupt, I paused at the door. He looked exhausted, the lines on his face and dark circles showing more than just fatigue. He spotted me and called, "Hey Jess, come look at this," pointing at the screen. I stepped in and glanced over his shoulder at a feed showing an empty room with curtains. What am I looking at?" I asked. "This is a live feed from our hospitality suite at the MGM Grand in Vegas," Peter said. "Watch this." He switched the view to a large hall and zoomed in on a construction area. "That's our Magnetidine booth for Expo," he explained. I frowned. "Why do you need a live feed from Expo?" Peter gestured to a woman nearby. "Debbie, tell Jess your idea." Debbie started excitedly explaining, "This is great. We can monitor the booth setup live and make any adjustments. It'll also let us see customer reactions in real time, and people at headquarters can finally see how their work impacts the show." Others chimed in with suggestions. Peter turned to me. "We've never tried anything like this before, Jess. We'll test it at Expo, and if it works, use it for future shows." "That's impressive," I said. "Mr. Moffat will be pleased." At the mention of Mr. Moffat, Debbie's face soured. "I hope he's impressed enough to recommend Peter over Scott Benson." She looked embarrassed, realizing I worked for Moffat. "I didn't mean it like that," she added, though it was clear she did. I silently agreed. Her comment sparked reactions from others, and Peter stepped in to calm things down. "We're all tense, but this is out of our hands. Let's focus on what we can control." "But if Scott becomes VP, life here will be miserable," someone said. "Exactly. Why can't they see he'd be a terrible leader?" added another. Peter's eyes lit up. "What if they could see? What if they saw me in action?" "Now that would be perfect, but how?" someone asked. Peter shared his plan, and the room buzzed with excitement and questions. The team's objections eventually turned into a solid plan. Peter raised his hand. "This could get attention from the execs, but could also backfire. If it does, I'll take the blame. We need to make sure no one else's involvement is visible." The group protested, but Peter stood firm. They agreed, albeit reluctantly, knowing they couldn't risk their jobs. I admired Peter's willingness to protect his team at his own risk. When the meeting ended, Peter asked me to stay. He looked serious. "Jess, you'll play a crucial role in this. We can try to hide your part, but it could come out. Are you willing to take that risk?" I thought it over. Working for Scott as VP would be unbearable, and what he'd done to Peter, using me to deliver his message, still stung. Remembering my own experiences with betrayal, I felt even more determined. "I'm in," I said. "Thanks, Jess," he replied, clearly moved. The day before Expo, Peter and his team flew to Vegas for final preparations. Once Expo started, it was a constant stream of demonstrations, customer meetings, and visitors at Magnetodyne's large exhibit. During my breaks, I visited the control room at headquarters to watch the live feed from the Expo floor. I often saw Peter working with the team, while Scott was usually seen socializing with important clients in the hospitality suite. To be fair, Scott looked capable in that role. Peter's plan was set for the last evening of Expo. After most of the major sales activities were done and when Scott's guard might be down, those of us in the know were tense, waiting for the plan to unfold. Everything had been timed precisely, and all we could do was wait. On the last day of Expo, I stayed at my desk until my phone rang, signaling it was time. I grabbed Mr. Moffat's smartphone. He rarely used it and had left it behind. With my text ready, I headed to the control center Peter's team had set up. On the monitor, Scott and his team were celebrating the show's success, drinks in hand. Peter glanced at his watch and gave a subtle nod toward the cameras. Debbie at the control station responded quietly, "Commence stage 1. Peter's team members began congratulating Scott's people, spreading the news discreetly. Debbie turned to me and said, "Get ready." I watched as Peter approached Scott, extending his hand. "Well, Scott, looks like you've won." "Congratulations," he said. Scott's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about, Peter?" "I heard Mr. Moffat announced his retirement at the executive committee meeting and that you've been chosen as his successor," Peter replied. Scott looked suspicious until one of his team members confirmed it, clapping him on the back and congratulating him. Debbie zoomed in on Scott's conflicted expression as he processed the news. Then she said to me, "That's your cue." I sent the pre-written text from Moffat's phone. Scott jumped as he read, "Congrats, Scott. I announced my retirement at executive committee today. You will be the new VP. We'll talk tomorrow." Moffat Scott pumped his fist. "Yes, I knew it." He showed Peter the text and shouted, "Read it and weep, Hamill." His team cheered, champagne flowed, and the music changed to celebrate. Peter approached Scott and returned the phone. "Any big plans, Scott, or will you follow Moffat's direction?" Scott sneered. "Things will change. Moffat was useless. I'm cleaning house, starting with marketing. And Peter, start updating your resume." He jabbed Peter's chest for emphasis. For a moment, I thought Peter might react, but he stayed composed and said, "We'll see, Scott, we'll see." The crowd around Scott pulled him away from the confrontation, and we heard him shout, "Come on, everyone, let's party. Drinks are on me." Peter turned to the hidden cameras and said quietly, "We got exactly what we needed. Tell everyone to leave the hospitality suite now. No confrontations." He adjusted the mic and the sound cut out. At the control desk, Debbie gave quick instructions, and Peter's team quietly left the suite. When the last person was out, she turned to me with a triumphant look. "We did it!" When Moffat and the other execs see Scott's outburst, they'll see the real him, and they won't like it. I felt like celebrating. It seemed too perfect. There might be questions about why Scott thought he was promoted, but Mr. Moffat and the others would likely overlook them given Scott's behavior. Not only had Scott insulted Mr. Moffat, but he also attacked the marketing team, which Moffat respected. I felt confident this would be Scott's downfall. I couldn't sleep that night, so I went to work early. Mr. Moffat always held post-show reviews, and I was eager for this one. The executive suite was empty when I arrived, so I went to Peter's area. There, I found Debbie crying at her desk. "Debbie, what happened?" I asked. She looked up, eyes red. "It's gone, all the footage from last night. The server crashed overnight, and we don't have a backup." Peter walked in, overhearing her. He turned pale. "What do we do now?" I asked. He shook his head. "I don't know. This could be bad." To my surprise, Peter comforted Debbie. "It's okay, Deb. It wasn't your fault. You did everything right. Sometimes things go wrong." "I should have backed it up," she sobbed. "No one could have expected the server to crash," he reassured her. He turned to me. "Get to your office and try to stall Mr. Moffat. I'll think of something." I nodded and left, holding back my own tears. We had lost the evidence, and now Peter had to explain his actions. What seemed like a victory had turned into a disaster. At my desk, I composed myself just as Mr. Moffat walked in, clearly furious. "Call Scott Benson's office and get him up here," he ordered. I called and informed Mr. Moffat that Scott hadn't arrived yet. "Tell her I need to see him as soon as he gets in, and get Peter up here too," he said. I called Peter. Mr. Moffat wants you and Scott here ASAP, I said quietly. And he's very angry. Peter sighed. All right, Jess, I'll be right there. When he arrived, he looked defeated, but gave me a weak smile before entering the office. I thought, it's probably my fate too when Mr. Moffat finds out. With the door open, I listened nervously. Mr. Moffat, usually composed, was direct. What can you tell me about the events at the Magnetodyne suite last night? Peter began. After Expo ended, we gathered at the suite to relax. Then, before he could finish, Scott Benson walked in, looking disheveled but smug. He glanced at Peter and then said to Mr. Moffat, Sorry for being late, boss. Last night's celebration got a bit out of hand. Mr. Moffat glared at Scott. What exactly were you celebrating? He demanded. Scott, unfazed, replied, My team was celebrating my promotion to VP after your retirement, as if explaining to a child. What? I never said I was retiring, Mr. Moffat shot back. Yes, you did, Scott insisted, at yesterday's executive committee meeting. I did not, Mr. Moffat said, his tone sharp, and there was no discussion of a successor. Peter exchanged a quick glance with me, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. Scott pushed on, holding up his phone. I have your text message here, he said confidently. Mr. Moffat looked baffled. I never sent you any text. Yes, you did, Scott said, scrolling through his phone, only to pause and frown. It's gone. Someone erased it. I thought I saw Peter smirk for a moment, but his expression was blank when Scott turned to him. Scott wasn't done. He grabbed Mr. Moffat's phone from the desk. No password? He muttered, checking the text messages, which were empty. Where are your texts? He demanded. I don't send texts, Mr. Moffat said, getting angrier. I make calls. Scott glanced around suspiciously. Someone erased the message announcing my promotion? He looked at Peter, then at me, making me duck out of sight. Young man, Mr. Moffat said sternly, we're here to discuss what happened in the hospitality suite. Care to explain? Scott stammered. It was just a celebration after I was tricked into thinking I'd been promoted. I see, Mr. Moffat said coldly. Ms. Martin, help me set up my computer. I expanded the screen and confirmed it was ready. Check my email for one from Lucas Masterson, Mr. Moffat directed. He turned to Scott and Peter. Does that name mean anything to you? Yes, Scott replied. He's president of Masterson Industries, our biggest client. Good, Mr. Moffat said dryly. Wouldn't you agree we should maintain a professional image with him? Of course, Scott said, puzzled. Mr. Moffat's voice grew colder. Lucas, an old friend, called last night, asking if our expo conduct was typical. When I didn't know, he sent photos. Ms. Martin, show them. I started the slideshow. The first image showed our sales team at the bar. The next showed Scott on stage, bottle in hand, leading a cheer, the company logo in the background. The following images depicted Scott with two young women, all clearly intoxicated, dancing provocatively. The room gasped when the next photo appeared. One woman had lost her clothes, and Scott was touching her as the crowd cheered. Then the final image flashed. Scott using a 3D model of the company logo inappropriately. Turn it off, Mr. Moffat barked. I shut down the screen. Mr. Benson, you disgraced yourself and Magnetodyne Industries, he thundered. Scott, red-faced, protested. This only happened because I was tricked into thinking I was promoted. Thank goodness you weren't promoted, Mr. Moffat shouted before regaining some composure. It doesn't matter why you acted that way. Your behavior was outrageous and unacceptable. Even without our top client witnessing it, you were setting a terrible example for your team. He turned to me abruptly. Ms. Martin, call HR and security. Have them escort Mr. Benson to his office and give him 15 minutes to gather his personal items. Effective immediately, he is terminated for cause. Yes, sir, I said quickly, and made the calls. Behind me, Scott yelled, This is all your fault, Hamill. You set me up. Before he could continue, security arrived and escorted Scott out. As they waited for the elevator, Peter stepped beside Scott. From my spot in the hallway, I heard Peter whisper, You betrayed me, and now it's your turn, Scott growled, but security stepped in between them. The elevator doors opened, and HR joined them as they left. Peter and I were left behind. As I turned to return, Peter said quietly, Come see me when you can. We need to talk. I nodded and returned to Mr. Moffat's office. Anything else you need, Mr. Moffat? I asked. He looked up, visibly exhausted. Yes, 3 things, Ms. Martin. First, I'm sorry for making you see those photos. I managed to stop before the worst, but I hadn't remembered what happened before. I smiled slightly at his consideration. Second, Please call Lucas Masterson so I can apologize and update him on our actions. I started for my desk, but he stopped me. And can you remove those photos from my computer and phone? I don't ever want to see them again. I nodded, taking his phone back to my desk. Before I left, he looked at me shrewdly. I don't know who led Scott to believe he'd been promoted, he said, making my heart pound. But I owe them gratitude for exposing Scott's true colors. I thought I saw a hint of a smile before he returned to his serious demeanor. Now, about that call to Lucas, he said, and I hurried out. By lunchtime, news of Scott's firing spread, and rumors ran wild. I avoided the chatter, not wanting any more suspicion than necessary. I visited Peter's office to share what Mr. Moffat had said, hoping it would reassure him. Although he listened, the weariness on his face persisted. Then, unable to shake my curiosity, I asked, "Peter, who are those women with Scott?" He gave a small smile. "Not sure, but probably free birds," he said. Seeing my confusion, he explained, "People who sneak into trade shows for free food, drinks, and parties. Sometimes more." "You never," I started to ask. "Never," he said firmly. "It's reckless, and I'm a faithful husband." He paused, bitterness crossing his face. My heart ached for him. "When do you plan to confront her?" I asked softly. "Tonight," he said with a sigh. "I have the papers ready, and will give them to Callie when she comes home." "I'm so sorry, Peter," I said. I almost forgot about her with all this Scott chaos. A thought struck me. "Peter, I still have those photos Lucas sent. Would it help to have a copy?" He considered it and nodded. "Yes, please. I want her to see who she chose over me." When I returned with the prints, he was ready to leave. "I need to be there when she arrives," he said, "and I might as well go. I won't be able to focus until this is done." "I understand," I told him. "But if you want to talk afterward, I'm here." "Thanks," he said. "I'd appreciate that. You're really the only one who knows everything." That evening, Marge invited me out for a drink, but I declined. I was drained from the morning's drama and worried about Peter. I couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation he was facing, and I knew I'd be poor company for Marge. For the second night in a row, I couldn't sleep well. I went into the office early, hoping to catch Peter. I was waiting by his office when he arrived, and he thanked me for the coffee I brought him. Seated on the office sofa and chair, I couldn't wait any longer and asked how things went with Callie. "About as you'd expect," he said, and began to tell me everything. I was at the kitchen table when Callie came home. She looked surprised to see me since I usually get home later. She sat across from me and asked what was going on. I handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked, and I told her to look. She opened it and started going through the screen captures from the video on Scott's porch. At first, she didn't understand what she was seeing, but when she got to the next picture, she gasped. She flipped through the rest quickly, her face turning red. I couldn't tell if she was more ashamed of what she did or of being caught. "Peter, I know I messed up, but it was just a one-time mistake. You were so busy with work, and it had been so long since we were intimate. When Scott approached me, I couldn't resist." I shook my head. "That's not true, Callie. This wasn't a one-time lapse. It was an ongoing affair." "No, I promise it only happened once." Instead of arguing, I played the video I had copied. Her face changed from discomfort to defensiveness to anger as she watched. When the audio of her laughter about making me a fool played, she shouted, "Turn it off!" I let it go a moment longer, then stopped it. "All right, you know about us. I assume those are divorce papers in the other envelope?" she asked coolly. I pushed the papers toward her, and she quickly scanned them. I thought she'd be shocked, but she was surprisingly calm. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I was going to file for divorce myself once Scott got his promotion." "So, you threw our marriage away for the money and status of being with a top executive?" I asked bitterly. "Peter, let's be realistic. You've been working long hours, ignoring me and getting nowhere," she said, and anger flared in me. "I was working for us, to make a better life." She gave me a patronizing smile. "That's what I thought for a while. But while I was redecorating Scott's house, he told me the truth about your career. You're stuck at Magnetodyne while he's about to move up. From the video, it seemed you were more interested in him than his career," I said coldly. She blushed. "Maybe I prefer both to what you offer," she retorted. I felt worn out. "So, you and Scott plan to marry after our divorce and his promotion?" "Exactly," she said. "What if I told you Scott isn't getting that promotion?" I said. Her eyes narrowed. "I'd say you were lying." What if I told you Scott was fired from Magnetodyne this morning? I added. I saw a flash of fear before she covered it. Impossible. His team's breaking records. They wouldn't fire him. I reached into my jacket and took out another envelope. What's that? She asked. Photos of Scott at the expo in Vegas earlier this week. Mr. Moffat found them quite interesting. I showed her the first photo. She relaxed a bit. No one's going to care about a sales director letting loose after a trade show, she said. She stayed quiet at the second photo, but looked uneasy. When I turned over the next one, she gasped. Who are those women with Scott? She asked, jealousy in her voice. I have no idea, I said. I've never seen them before, but Scott certainly seems to know them well, I add, turning over the next photo. She said nothing, but her expression darkened at the pole dance image. When she saw the photo of Scott acting inappropriately with the company logo, she slammed her fist on the table. The final two photos, showing Scott engaged in various acts with the women, made her break down and cry. How could he betray me like that? She sobbed. How could he embarrass me in front of all those people? The irony of her reaction left me speechless. After a moment, she looked up at me with red, tear-filled eyes. Is it true? She asked. Is what true? I snapped. Scott said you were involved with your boss's secretary. Is that why you started an affair with Scott? I asked in disbelief. I saw her and she's so beautiful. I thought you couldn't resist her. Not everyone has the same morals as you and Scott. For the record, I've always been completely faithful, I said, shaking my head. I can't believe you believed a salesman's lies. She buried her face in her hands, crying harder. I stood up, grabbed my keys, and went out to get dinner. When I returned, I saw that Callie had packed her things and left. I felt so bad listening to him. That must have been awful, Peter, I said when he finished. How are you holding up? Honestly, he said, my emotions are all over the place. I feel bitter about Callie's betrayal, but I'm also sad about the end of my marriage. I'm glad Scott got what he deserved, but I feel exhausted by everything. Mostly, I just feel drained. I know it's hard, Peter, but it will get better, I said, even though the executives tried to keep the details of Scott's firing under wraps. Too many people knew some version of the story, and it became the main topic of office gossip for weeks. Ironically, Scott's former team spread the story the most, perhaps as payback for how he treated them. Peter's team kept their thoughts private, but seemed pleased by the outcome. Unfortunately, details about Scott's involvement in Peter and Callie's divorce also circulated. People didn't directly question Peter, but whispers and side glances were common whenever he left a room. I hated it for him, but there wasn't much I could do. Knowing what I did, I stayed quiet and checked in on Peter regularly, finding reasons to stop by his office or join his team for lunch. Marge would sometimes take me to her favorite bar after work. As the CEO's assistant, she likely knew as much as I did, but she never brought it up. She would ask how Peter was doing, and I kept her informed. Oddly, she also asked how I was holding up, though I was only indirectly involved. I always reassured her that I was fine. About 4 months later, Debbie, who ran the control desk at Expo, called me. She said Peter's team was planning a surprise celebration after work and asked if I'd like to join. When I asked why, she explained that Peter's divorce had just been finalized. I told her I'd be there. The celebration was held in a private room at a bar popular with the marketing team. The room was decorated with banners saying, "Free at last," "Peter is available," and "Look out, ladies." It seemed juvenile and tasteless to me, but everyone else enjoyed it. The noise was loud, fueled by several kegs of beer being quickly emptied. It was nice to see how much Peter's team valued him, but when I saw him, he didn't seem to be enjoying the party as much as everyone else. Someone coaxed him to make a speech, and after resisting, he climbed onto a table. He kept it brief, thanking everyone for the party and acknowledging their hard work at Expo. Then he told them to keep having fun and stepped down. As the party continued, I made my way to him and we sat at an empty table. "Thanks for coming, Jess," he said. "What do you think of the party?" I studied his face and noticed the lines around his eyes were still there. More importantly, "How do you feel about it, Peter?" I asked. The smile he was trying to maintain slipped, revealing how unhappy he really was. I know I should be excited about being single again, but honestly, I just feel down, and I'm not even sure why. I think I know why because it's exactly how I felt after my divorce. My guess is you're feeling low because you're mourning the loss of your marriage. But that doesn't make sense, Jess. I don't want to be with Callie anymore, not after what she did and how she treated me. I could never trust her again, he said intensely. Of course not, I said gently, but what you're grieving is different. You probably always imagined yourself in a committed relationship, maybe starting a family. Callie shattered that vision, so it makes sense you feel down. You've lost the life you thought you'd have." He looked at me thoughtfully and slowly nodded. "There's a lot of truth to that, Jess." He looked at me again. "Thanks for being such a good friend." At that moment, some of his coworkers came over and grabbed his arm. "Enough of this serious talk, Peter. Come on, join us." They pulled him away, but he smiled and waved at me as he left. I slipped out shortly after and headed home. Parties like that aren't my thing, but I felt good knowing I could be there for Peter and found myself smiling on my way home. With his divorce finalized, I kept waiting for Peter to lift out of his depression. In some ways, it was clear he was healing, but it didn't seem to change how he acted around me. He would wave and smile when he saw me, and we still connected easily during conversations. But I kept searching for something more that I never found. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Moffat called me into his office. After asking me to close the door, he gestured for me to sit. "Please keep this confidential, Miss Martin," he said. "Remember the executive committee meeting during Expo? I did tell the committee I was planning to retire, but after the mess with Scott Benson, they asked me to stay and help fix things. Now that everything is back on track, I'm moving forward with my retirement. I'll be announcing it after lunch, but I wanted to give you a heads up." I was stunned by the news, but appreciated his thoughtfulness. "There's something else you should know," he continued. "You'll have a new boss, Peter Hamill. I hope that's good news for you." "Oh, Mr. Moffat, I'm thrilled for Peter, but I'll miss working for you. You've been wonderful." I stood up and hugged him. He smiled and said some kind words before asking me to call Peter to his office. When their meeting ended and Peter came out, I made sure to congratulate him on his well-deserved promotion. "Thanks, Jess," he said warmly. "That means a lot." As he walked away, his warmth lingered with me, but by the afternoon I felt down again. At the end of the day, Marge came by and asked me to join her at the tavern. "Marge, I have things to do at home," I said, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. Her persistence, which made her so valuable to the CEO, left me with no choice but to agree. At the tavern, she leaned across the table and looked at me intently. "All right, Jess, what's going on?" "I don't know what you mean, Marge," I said defensively. "Nonsense," she said, surprising me with her rare use of strong language. "You've been moping around for weeks like someone with a sick pet, and today you're acting like it died. I'd think you'd be happy about working for Peter. So what's wrong?" I tried to hold back, but something broke inside, and I found myself wiping away tears as I tried to explain. "Peter's promotion is the last straw, Marge. I don't know if I can handle seeing him every day." "I don't get it, Jess. Why not?" I sniffled. "I know his wife's affair and the divorce were hard on him, but I thought once it was over, he might relax around me, maybe want to go out. But he still treats me like just a friend, part of the team. It's tearing me up." Marge's expression softened. "You really care about him, don't you? You always have." "No," I objected. "I didn't have feelings for him while he was married. I admired him and liked working with him, but it was purely professional. I would never let myself get interested in a married man." "For someone who wasn't interested like that, you sure spent a lot of time with him," Marge said dryly. "I had to," I replied. "He was an important part of Mr. Moffat's team." "Uh-huh, sure," Marge said with a hint of sarcasm. "But after you saw his wife with Scott, your perspective started to change." "How did you know that?" I gasped. Marge just smiled knowingly. Then her expression turned serious. "So you thought you had a connection with Peter and hoped it would turn into something special, right?" "I guess so," I admitted softly. She looked at me for a moment, then said, "You know, you really are being clueless." "Now, wait a minute, Marge," I said, annoyed. "You might be my friend, but you can't talk to me like that." She crossed her arms and leaned forward. "I meant what I said. You're acting clueless." "Now listen to me. Half the people at Magnetodyne know you have a big crush on Peter Hamill. But what have you done to show him that?" "I've done plenty," I said defensively. "I visit him whenever I can. I make it a point to sit with his team at lunch in the cafeteria. "Isn't that what you did when he was still married?" Marge interrupted. "Well, yes," I admitted. "But not as often," I added weakly. "So how would he know your feelings have changed if your behavior hasn't?" she asked. Before I could answer, she pressed on. "Have you ever even touched him?" "No," I said, surprised. "I would never do that." "I mean, touched his arm or hand, something to create a connection." "I'm sure I have," I said, stalling, but I couldn't remember a specific instance. "You're afraid to touch men because you think they'll misinterpret it, aren't you?" "Maybe a little," I admitted. She continued looking at me. Then she said, "You know what your problem is, Jess? You're too beautiful." I opened my mouth to speak, but Marge cut me off. Your whole life, you've relied on your looks. You never had to worry about finding men. They were always coming to you. I bet your first husband approached you, not the other way around. I looked down at the table. Well, maybe. He did come up to me at a college party. Exactly. You're used to being passive, waiting for the guy to make the first move. If he doesn't, you dismiss him and wait for the next one. And that's not all. You use your beauty as a shield to keep men at a distance, even those you might actually be interested in. And you do that not out of arrogance or ego, but because you're scared. You're afraid to take a risk and open yourself up, worried that you might make a bad choice. So you hide behind your looks, hoping that Mr. Right will find a way to break through those defenses. I was speechless, but Marge continued. I'd bet that the reason you're so afraid is because the one man you chose, the one you believed was Mr. Right, ended up being your biggest mistake. Since then, you've been too scared to take a risk again. So even though part of you wants to build something with Peter, another part tells you to step back and wait. You just linger and hope he'll break through and chase you. I couldn't meet her eyes. She came over, hugged me, and kissed my cheek. Think about what I said, Jess. See if there's any truth to it. Then she left. That night, I lay in bed, tossing and turning, replaying Marge's words. Some of what she said stung, and not all of it was accurate. But I had to admit she'd been right about many things. By early morning, I made a decision. Even then, I barely slept. When I got to work, I made a phone call and moved ahead with my plan. I wasn't sure it was the right move, but at least I wasn't being passive. Shortly after I returned to my desk, Peter came to meet with Mr. Moffat again. They spent a long time reviewing marketing plans, but eventually the meeting ended. As Peter passed my desk, he said, I'm looking forward to working more closely with you, Jess. I took a deep breath and stood up. Peter, I met with HR this morning and arranged for a transfer. In 2 weeks, I'll be starting in a new department. He stepped back as if I'd slapped him. But why, Jess? Did I do something to upset you? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mr. Moffat standing in his doorway looking concerned. I kept my focus on Peter. No, Peter, it's not you. It's me. Over the past few months, I've developed strong feelings for you. But company policy prohibits relationships between employees and their supervisors. And since I want to pursue those feelings, I can't work under you. Over Peter's shoulder, I saw Marge peeking around the corner. I kept my eyes on him, holding my breath as I waited for his reaction. He looked at me in shock. But you never said or did anything, he said. I glanced at Marge. I know, I said. But I'm saying it now. Peter stayed silent, and time felt like it had slowed. Then, with my heart pounding, he stepped forward and took my shoulders in his hands. Given the circumstances, I think we can skip the customary 2 weeks' notice, he said, and kissed me with such intensity and promise that I barely heard the applause coming from Marge and Mr. Moffat.